Jared Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com, and this is pretty much a follow-up to the video that I made a couple of months ago that said that the photography world is about to change. And well, it has finally changed now that Nikon and Canon have gone full mirrorless to try and compete in a market that Sony has ruled for the last 5 years. Now, I've used the Nikon, the Canon, and the Sony. Of course, I've used the Sonys more extensively because there's an A7R III, an A7 III, an A9, and Canon has the EOS R that we spent a couple days using, and we only have a couple of hours spent using the Nikon Z7. But I have some thoughts and some ideas on what I like in these systems and what I don't like in these systems, and also where I think the photo industry needs to go. So you could consider this a State of the Union for photography and a follow-up to that last video. So Sony has a 5-year head start. They've been cranking out systems since the Next system and the A7 systems, and they've evolved. They've gotten a hell of a lot better than where they started. But what I think has happened is now that Canon, sleeping giant, Nikon, sleeping giant, have decided to jump into it, their first forays are better than what Sony started out doing 5 years ago. But of course that should be that way, being that you've had 5 years extra time to try and get something right, or we don't even know when Nikon and Canon started working on their mirrorless systems. But they finally did it, they finally put them out. Are they great? No, they're good. And again, with the Z7, we haven't had it long enough in our hands to tell you how good or how bad it is, but there are things in that camera that are definitely promising that I've seen when using them. Now, let's talk about the things that we do know, because I've held on to all of these cameras. The feel of the Canon, I think, is the best out of all three of the systems, the Nikon, the Canon, and the Sonys. The Canon EOS R feels like a DSLR in your hands. It's substantial feeling. It isn't a small mirrorless camera that tried to be smaller and lighter. It's a camera. The Nikon Z7 has an unbelievably great feeling grip on it. Now, I'm not talking about that battery grip with the lack of button on it that they decided to do. I'm talking about how it feels in your hands. Buttons feel really good in these cameras. The tactile functions, the feel, when you press a button, you know that you're pressing the button. Now, on the flip side, the Sonys are still boxy. When you pick it up and put it in your hands, it's much smaller than the Nikon and the Canon. It's a smaller mirrorless camera even when you add the grip. But one of the issues I've had with the Sonys, and it's now more prevalent that I've held on to the Nikons and Canons, is the fact that the rubber they use feels slippery. It just feels like the thing doesn't feel good in your hands. The grip isn't as deep as the Nikon and Canon. It's more shallow, so it just doesn't feel as good. The buttons, they're more flush with the body. They just seem to be sometimes, the joystick's in the perfect place, that's perfect. They have a lot of extra buttons that you have to get used to where to find them that you can program. All that stuff is great because they have all those features. It's just they need to do better with the design. The feel of the Sonys, they feel boxy. They don't feel substantial. They don't feel great in your hands now when you compare them to using the Nikon or when you use the new Canons. Now let's talk about the electronic viewfinders. The electronic viewfinder on the Nikon is really good. At least in the couple of hours I had to use it in a low light situation, it just looked bright, it looked vibrant, it looked sharp, it looked clear. The Canon one is incredible. The first thing I noticed when I picked up that Canon camera is that the EVF, even outside, felt like it was an optical viewfinder. The focus points light up red, which is great. You can find them, you can move around, and that's great. Now, the Sony EVF, I've always had some issues with it. They've got the higher res one on the A9 and I believe the A7R III and a lower res one on the A7 III. And I've said this in the past to them that say you're shooting landscapes and you're shooting trees and leaves and you look up and you can't really see the fine details. You're not getting the sun streaks coming through the tops of the trees right. It just doesn't look sharp. It doesn't look clear. That's what I'm getting out of the Sony EVFs. They don't seem to be as good as the Nikon and the Canon. though they probably do make the EVFs for Nikon and Canon. Now that's something that Sony can get right in whatever future iterations they have, because they've been doing this a while. They can still make it better. I also will say that the screen, the LCD screens on the back of the Sonys don't come close to matching the quality of the Nikon or the Canon. So we know that Sony has had a head start. They've done a great job. And I think they will continue to do a great job evolving their system into the future. It's just now a three-horse race, and I would not discount Nikon or Canon because they've been around a long time. Do they move slow? Yes. Do they need to start iterating faster? Absolutely. But I know that they can do it. With all of this stuff that I'm saying, this is a good problem for the industry to have. It's great to have a three-horse race because they are going to push each other. Now, one thing I will point out that I've never liked in the Sonys and complained a ton about is that when you look for your focusing points, they are gray. Your focus point is gray. Until it's in focus, then it's green, but you can never find where your focus is. A lot of the times I find myself hitting the IAF button that I've mapped so that it could just show me the focus on the face or the eye. IAF is the greatest thing since sliced bread in the Sony. Nikon, Canon, Fuji, nobody else can match what Sony has there, but they need to change the colors of these points. Now, why is that important? Because you can't find them. Nikon, when we use those, they have 3 different colors. It's green when it's in focus, it's red when you're moving them around, and there's a yellow one for when you're doing selection of the face, or it's doing face tracking. So there's 3 different colors. You can always see your focusing points. With the Sony, you just can't. Now let's talk about lenses. Sony has a lot of native lenses for their system. They have a major jump start on both Nikon and Canon. So they're way ahead of the game there because they have a ton of lenses that are ready to go right on this camera, including third-party native lenses that have native mounts to go on this camera, to go on the Sony cameras. Nikon has announced their roadmap. Will they be able to meet that roadmap? Hopefully, but we don't know if they will. But they have a nice looking roadmap on the way. Again, not too happy with the initial S line that they've launched with. Now, Canon on the flip side did something great with launching with a 51.2 and a 28-70 f2. This is going to continue to evolve. This is the race. It's about glass. Nikon has 100 million lenses out there. Canon has 100 million lenses out there. Sony doesn't have that just yet. You can adapt your lenses with the Nikon and the Canon natively, seamlessly. They work perfect. You can, of course, get third-party adapters for the Sony, but they are not as good as when you get the native adapters for the Nikon and the Canon. Now, here's the state of the union part of this video. We need to stop overanalyzing every little thing that these cameras offer. I'm talking about overanalyzing things and nitpicking and finding issues where there aren't issues or there's human error. We all make mistakes, but we have to acknowledge them when they happen. But we have to stop nitpicking. We need to get back to saying, get out there and shoot your photos. My goal with my reviews is to give you the ammunition to determine whether or not this camera is for you. I am not the most technically savvy person when it comes to what is color science inside of a sensor. What I do know is how to capture a great image. I do understand the fundamentals of photography: exposure triangle, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. I will continue to push the fact that if you understand the exposure triangle and your composition, you can get great results no matter what camera you pick up, whether it's 10 years old, whether it's the latest and greatest, whether it's a Nikon, Canon, Sony, Fuji, Pentax, Olympus. It doesn't matter. Focus on understanding the fundamentals first, and you will get great images. I don't think there is a bad camera made today, other than the Lytro, but that's why they went out of business. There is no bad camera today. There's bad photographers. There's photographers that have no clue what they're doing. The point is that everybody needs to become a better photographer, understand the fundamentals, and stop harping on nitpicking and finding every little subtle nuance that could be wrong. There's pros and cons to all of these systems. In 2018, if you can't get a great image with any camera that you put in your hands, it's on you. So that's pretty much it, guys. I just wanted to point out some of the differences that I've found right off the bat from using the Nikon, the Canon mirrorless, as well as all of the Sony mirrorlesses, that this is a race. Sony had a 5-year head start. Nikon and Canon are going to catch up quick. Their first models out are very good entries into this mirrorless world. We know that when Sony started out, they needed to find their way. Nikon and Canon, they're gonna catch up really quick, and this is going to be an interesting next couple of years to see where these companies go. But having a three-horse race is really good for the photography world. But again, let me reiterate, if you understand the exposure triangle, the fundamentals of photography, what you're doing, how to get your composition, I don't care what system you use, I don't care what camera you use, I don't care if you use the old stuff or the new stuff. You should be able to get good results with anything you put in your hand. Next, it's going to be the subtle nuances to determine which system you want to go with. And honestly, once you go with a system, I'd probably stick with it. So that's a state of the union. I'm going to leave it there right now. Let me know what you think down below. Leave some comments. Don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, all of that good stuff. And if you haven't downloaded My Gear Vault, of course, go download My Gear Vault. It's the best way to input, organize, and protect your gear. And it's free for iOS and Android. And that's it, guys. Jared, Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com. See ya.